Okay, everyone, we're going to cover chapter 15, which is our first chapter for unit 5. And so we're going to get into the anatomy of the respiratory system. We break it primarily into upper and lower, is our kind of two main divisions. And these are going to consist of all of the structures, and the main goal being to acquire oxygen or bring oxygen into the body and remove carbon dioxide from the blood. The reason we actually need oxygen is because it's part of the reaction for ATP, which is how we utilize energy, or the energy molecule that our cells use. So the reason we need to get rid of CO2 is because it's a byproduct of that ATP production. CO2 is a waste. So O2, or oxygen, is a ingredient, or on the left half of the reaction, carbon dioxide is a waste, or on the right half of the reaction. And so cells use oxygen to make ATP, and then carbon dioxide needs to be removed from those cells in the blood, and we get rid of that back into the environment. Part of the reason we need to get rid of this carbon dioxide is because if we have a buildup of carbon dioxide, it is going to make the pH lower. So think for a second if that means it's more acidic or more basic. So correct, more acidic. So remember, we talked about the homeostasis and equilibrium of the body being very finicky and important to maintain. So pH, we only have a 7.35 to 7.45 normal range. So we need to make sure that CO2 or carbon dioxide levels stay in check. So before I move on, let me just highlight that means that one of our respiratory system's functions is to help regulate pH. So that's one of the less obvious functions of the respiratory system that you need to know for the test. So we're going to start with our upper respiratory system, or upper respiratory tract. We start with the external nose. And so that contains or starts the nasal cavity. That includes our nares, which is the fancy word for our nostrils. And then the nasal septum is what runs down the midline of the nose and separates our right and left nares, or nostril. So the purpose of our nasal cavity is, one, it helps clean the air. So we have hair cells that are located in mucous membranes that can try to help catch debris before it gets into the body. It's also going to warm and humidify our air prior to it passing further into the body. The pharynx is also known as just the throat, or kind of back of the throat, and it's a shared passageway for food and air. We break that into three separate kind of subsections. We have the nasopharynx, which is kind of just posterior and inferior to the nasal cavities. We have the oropharynx, which is the throat right behind the mouth. And then we have the laryngopharynx, where our pharynx starts to transition to the larynx. So the larynx is only part of the respiratory system. The pharynx is part of both the respiratory and digestive systems. That's another important thing to know. So the larynx is also known as the voice box. It contains, we'll get to that. Okay, so trachea is our windpipe, and so that's part of our respiratory system. That's how we get air in. The esophagus we'll talk about in the digestive chapter, and that's our passageway for food. So trachea is for air, the esophagus is for food. So like I said, the common name for the trachea is the windpipe, and so that is how we're going to get air to our lungs. The bronchi are the tubes that actually branch into each lung. So we have a right and a left primary bronchi. So we have a split, and that middle part of the split we call the carina. So the carina is where our bronchi split, right for the right lung, left for the left lung. And then of course our lungs are where we actually are trying to get the air. And so these are kind of like labyrinths or tunnels of air tubes. And they have a really complex network of air sacs, which are called alveoli. And on these alveoli, we have capillaries. And so this is where the site of gas exchange between our air and blood occurs. So the goal of our respiratory system is to get the air to ventilate our alveoli. The capillaries lie right on the surface of the alveoli, so they can drop off their carbon dioxide and pick up the oxygen. So alveoli is where our actual site of gas exchange is. So like I said, our kind of primary split of the respiratory system is upper and lower. So the nose to the larynx is our upper respiratory tract. The trachea all the way down through the alveoli where gas exchange is happening is the lower respiratory tract. So we can also talk about it as a conducting zone versus a respiratory zone. So conducting zone is from our nose all the way into our bronchioles or the smaller bronchi that are just ventilating. So no gas exchange is occurring in the conducting zone. The respiratory zone is the capillaries, our terminal bronchioles or respiratory bronchioles, and the alveoli, where we're actually having gas exchange occur. So upper and lower, and then conducting versus respiratory. So it makes sense. So it's just conducting the air to the respiratory zone. So here's a diagram to summarize that a bit. So upper respiratory tract, we said our nasal cavity and external nose. So you can see we have some cutouts or kind of hollow canals here where the air can get warm and it gets humidified. We have the pharynx, as I said, remember that one is part of the respiratory and digestive system. So that's a common passageway for both food and air. And then we're on the respiratory system. So our next step is the larynx or voice box. And then we have the trachea. This point here where we have our split is known as the carina. And then we have our primary bronchi splitting into our right and left lung. You'll notice the mouth is not included in the respiratory system. We can breathe through our mouth, but you'll see it's not actually included. So that's our digestive system for the mouth, not respiratory. All right, getting into the functions. So ventilation is moving air into and out of the lungs. So that's the actual act of breathing is ventilation. I'm going to jump down to 3 for a second. So gas transport, so oxygen and carbon dioxide travel in the blood. So they travel as a gas. We refer to them or their concentrations in the blood or in the alveoli as partial pressures. So that's gas transport. So external versus internal respiration, 2 versus 4. So external respiration, we're talking about our external environment and our lungs. So this is when we're exchanging oxygen from the air, which comes into our lungs, and we exchange it in that capillary network over the alveoli into the blood. That blood drops off carbon dioxide into the alveoli in exchange, and we breathe that back out into the external environment. So that's external. Internal is what's happening at the body tissue level. So this is when our blood is now dropping off that oxygen that it picked up in the alveoli, and it's going to then bring back carbon dioxide from the tissue. So there's the exchange there. So external is between the lungs and the environment, and then the alveoli and capillary network there. Internal is when we're actually at the tissue level. So if you kind of more think, we're going to have blood dropping oxygen off to muscle tissue, and our muscle tissue is going to give back its CO2 waste to the blood to take back to the lungs. That's internal respiration. Sorry for the barking, guys. All right, we talked about this one being our sneaky one to make sure you remember the regulation of blood pH. So blood pH is going to change primarily due to changes in CO2 levels. And so most of our CO2, we'll hit this again, is actually transported as bicarbonate ions. So when we're looking at CO2 levels, oftentimes they're going to monitor the bicarbonate ion level of the blood. And just a reminder, increased levels of CO2 or carbon dioxide are going to make the blood more acidic. It's going to bring our pH down. Production of chemical mediators. So it's part of the process of activating the enzyme angiotensin, or the hormone pathway angiotensin, which is important in regulating blood pressure. So that's one of the other ones that's not quite as obvious of an example. And then voice production, of course, because air moving past our vocal cords is what actually produces sound. A couple other ones, olfaction, the sense of smell. So even though the sense of smell is related to our sense of taste, taste or gustation is not one of our respiratory system functions, just olfaction. And then protection, it's part of our innate immune system. So those mucous membranes and the hair cells that are trying to stop debris are part of our immune system. So here's just another reminder. We have upper respiratory is external nose, the nasal cavity, the pharynx, and the larynx. And I'm going to go ahead and pause there for a second because I'm getting a message that it is disconnecting. So we will come back with part 2.